Hi, this is John Guest again, and this is going to be a short video to go with the article on the economics of alcohol consumption in the UK, which is in volume 35, number 2 of the Economic Review in November 2017. So there were 3 questions on the article. There's some written answers for questions 1 and 2. So this is a short video. Sorry, there were written answers for question 1 and 3. This is a short video for question 2. So what was question 2? Question 2 was, can you draw a diagram similar to figure 1 in the text and illustrate how the elasticity of demand and supply determine the incidence of tax on alcohol and the revenue it will raise for the government? So let's go straight to the diagram. So hopefully this is a fairly accurate representation of the article, in the figure 1 in the article. So I've even tried to keep the lines of the colours of the lines the same, so I've made the supply curve orange as it is in the article and the supply curve plus tax grey. We've got units of alcohol per week on the horizontal axis and price per unit of alcohol on the vertical axis. So as the article explains, we're originally at point E. We impose the tax, which causes the supply curve to shift upwards. All I've added to figure 1, which I think is useful, is this little point here to make us think about exactly why the supply curve shifts the way it does. Because now, if we think about point G, this is telling us what the price would have to be for the firms to still sell Q1. So originally they'd sell Q1 at a price of P1, but now because they've got to pay tax to the government, they would need a price of P1 plus that tax, that sort of revenue, to get them to supply the same amount. Perhaps the other thing to observe is that the supply curve is shifted to the left in a parallel manner, and this represents the fact that we're looking at the impact of a specific or a fixed tax. In the answer to question 1, we analysed how we tax alcoholic drinks in the UK, and we talked a bit about the specific element of tax known as excise duty, and in particular how that works, how we tax alcohol by volume. Okay, so really the question is, well, how does this change if elasticity changes? So what we're going to focus on here is the revenue. So the revenue will be the amount traded after the tax, which is Q2, because this is the market clearing price, and quantity after the tax is imposed, we're at point C. The total tax revenue the government will raise will be area P2, C, D, P3, which is simply the amount of the tax, the vertical distance between the supply curves, and the amount that's traded. If we look at the extent to which the price has gone up, it's obviously gone up from P1 to P2. Notice it's not gone up by the full amount of the tax. So out of this tax revenue P2, C, D, P3, this area here is the amount that's been picked up by the consumer. So it's the instance of the tax on the consumer, and that is area P1, P2, C, F. But as we said, the producer's not been able to pass it all on to the consumer. They've had to absorb them themselves, and the extent to which they've had to absorb the tax is illustrated by the area P1, F, D, P3. So the question is, if we change the elasticity of either demand or supply, what impact will this have on the total revenue, the amount that's effectively picked up by the consumer, and the amount that's effectively picked up by the producer? So, for example, what would happen if demand became much more inelastic? And we might expect for alcohol that demand is fairly price insensitive. So let's go to the next figure. So we've drawn a more inelastic demand curve. We're at point E. This is the market clearing weight. We're at the price of P1 and a quantity traded of Q1. We impose the tax, so the supply curve moves from S to S plus tax. Again, I've put this same point on there, point G, to help us think about how much the price would have to increase to get the suppliers to supply the same amount they did before the tax was imposed. So the price would have to go up by the full amount of the tax to get the suppliers to supply what they did previously. We can see that the new market clearing rate is at point C. The market will move from point E to point C. The quantity traded falls from Q1 to Q2. Notice it doesn't fall by as much as it did in figure 1 or in the previous diagram. The price increases in the market from P1 to P2. And we can see with the inelastic demand, the producer is able to pass on more of the tax that they legally have to pay onto the consumer in the form of higher prices. The total tax revenue raised, once again, will depend on the quantity that is traded after the tax. Remember, it can't be Q1 because you only pay the tax when the good is traded, so we really have to focus on the amount that is traded after the tax is imposed. Remember, the market clearing rate or the market clearing output is determined by point C, where the demand and the new supply curve intersect each other, so Q2 is the amount traded. The vertical distance between the supply curves is the amount of the tax, so the tax revenue is P2, C, D, P3. I've had to put a little arrow there because we're running out of space on the axis, so I've moved P3 and put a little arrow to where it goes precisely on the axis. So just to repeat that, the tax revenue is area P2, C, D, P3. Notice it's bigger than it was in figure 1 because output's fallen by a smaller amount. In effect, the tax has had a smaller impact on consumer behaviour, and because it has a smaller impact on consumer behaviour, in other words, less people respond by buying less of the good, it's enabled the government to raise more revenue. Now let's put point F on there to help us identify the instance of the tax. So we can see that the amount of this whole area, so P2, C, D, P3 is the total tax. The amount of that that's being borne by the consumer, the extent to which the prices have been passed on, is area P2, C, F, P1. So this area here. And we can see that quite a large majority now, or large proportion of the tax incidence is being picked up by the consumer. The area P1, F, D, P3 is the amount that's borne by the producer, or the amount being absorbed by the producer. So in that whole area now, the amount being borne by the consumer is a much bigger share, and this reflects the fact that the suppliers are able to pass on the tax onto the consumers in the form of higher prices. So if we make demand more price inelastic, tax revenue will be greater, and a higher proportion of the tax incidence will go on the consumers in this example than the producers. What happens if we make supply more price inelastic? So we've tilted the supply curve round through point E, so it's much steeper. Again, we illustrate the impact in tax with that leftward shift. Again, we can identify point G, the extent to which the price would have to rise to keep supply at the same level. And we can identify point C again, which is the new market price. We go from point E to point C when the supply curve shifts to the left. And you'll notice straight away that the increase in price in this example is much smaller than it was previously. It's gone from P1 to just P2. Output's fallen from Q1 to Q2. If we identify point D again, this helps us to identify the total tax revenue. Remember, yet again, the tax revenue is the amount traded after the tax. This vertical distance here multiplied by the quantity that's traded after the tax, which is Q2. So the total tax revenue will be P2, C, D, P3. The incidence of the tax, well, we can see straight away if we identify point F here that the with the inelastic supply, the producer has not been loading so much of the tax onto the consumer in the form of higher prices. So the tax incidence on the consumer out of this whole rectangle, remember yet again the tax revenue is P2, C, D, P3. The incidence on the consumer is P1, P2, C, F. Notice it's a relatively small proportion of the total tax revenue. Because the price isn't going up by so much, the producer is having to absorb more of the tax, and we can illustrate the producer's share of the tax, or the incidence of the taxation, by area P1, F, D, P3. So the producer is now having to absorb a lot more of the tax when supply is inelastic. Obviously, I'll leave it up to you to work through all different types of variations of this. We could make supply more elastic, we could make demand more elastic, and you could work through the diagrams and see what impact this has on the incidence of taxation. Once again, I hope you found that presentation useful, and thanks for listening.